I'm Abraham Jones, representing West Michigan Cybersecurity Consortium. I'm a cybersecurity architect for a large organization here in Michigan. We spend a lot of money on securing our enterprise, and we use the Scythe platform to validate what we are spending our money on. We also use it during POCs to validate that tools that we're going to purchase are doing what they're supposed to do.
To find out more about Scythe, visit scythe.io/securityweekly. Pfingst Canary makes high-fidelity honeypots that set up in minutes and requires no ongoing administration. Attackers moving silently on your network advertise their presence by tripping over them. There's a good reason Pfingst Canaries are deployed and loved by some of the best security teams in the world. They're inexpensive, they're simple, and they work. For more information, go to securityweekly.com/canary or direct message @Pfingstcanary on Twitter. Domain tools help security analysts turn threat data into threat intelligence. They take indicators from your network, including domains and IP addresses, and connect them with nearly every active domain on the internet. Those connections drive risk assessments, help profile attackers, guide online fraud investigations, and map cyber activity to attacker infrastructure. Fortune 1000 companies, global government agencies, and leading security solutions vendors use the Domain Tools platform as a critical ingredient in their threat investigations and proactive defenses. For more information, visit securityweekly.com/domain tools. Well, welcome back, everyone, to Paul's Security Weekly. This is the security news. Matt, we have a listener list.
We do. So the listener list allows people to sign up and tell us what their interests are. Part of the service is going to allow us to start to tag content and notify people based on segments that we do that they're available for them to download. So they can get really direct kind of data that they're interested in from the network.
This is by request, actually. Over the years, as we've spoken to listeners, they're like, love listening to Security Weekly. It's great. However, we're just overwhelmed with content, and we want to subscribe to what interests us the most at that time, too. Right. And that's going to change, right? And I really think that, like, if I go back in my career and I look at the projects I was on, there was a time when I was like really interested in, firewalls and next generation firewalls, right? And then, I got my firewall project for that point in time completed. And then my next project was NAC, or network admission control. So I really wanted to learn about that, right? And I think what our listeners are asking is what the projects that they're working on or see on the horizon, those are the things they want to know about to consume right away, because it's in their critical path of what they're working on now. I think there's also general things where people will listen to everything in just kind of a general educational sense. But, if you're in that role, defending an enterprise, most of our listeners are, you probably want to subscribe to different specific content that we're producing. So.
Yeah, we produce, 14 to 16 segments a week? So that's a lot for people to get through to say, well, do I want to listen to that segment or this segment?
It's like 14 hours or 15 hours a week or something.
Yeah, exactly. Like that. And so this will give us an ability to start to tag content and then allow us to notify people when that content's available, giving them specific access to that episode, one of those segments.
Because sometimes you miss it too. And I do that with, video channels or podcasts. I'm like, I'll go back and then I'll take the time to scroll through the archive. I'm like, oh, how did I miss that? I really want to listen to that.
Right. So this is a way for people to sign up, tell us what their interests are, and then over time, what we're going to do is start to target and tag our content so that we can notify you when that's available and give you that information just so you can get to the right stuff that we're producing on a weekly basis a little easier, and so you don't miss an episode.
Now, the URL's kind of long.
I know, it's a crazy URL. Thank Dan for this one.
We'll fix it.
Yeah, we got to shorten it, I think.
If only there was a way to shorten a URL.
We need to
do that. Bitly? Yeah, and then I'm reading
That's not a thing.
14.
You can't shorten URLs.
securityweekly.com/join the listener list, separated by dashes. But we'll have a better URL next time. I feel like we have a lot of URLs we want you to visit. Yeah. Just go to securityweekly.com and poke around and find your stuff, and we'll have a better, easy to remember
Join
URL.
-the list.
And you can even finger securityweekly.com.
You could try.
You know what I mean?
Sure.
Certain individuals, yes. Other individuals, maybe not.
That's right. I wanted to start the news segment by talking about a few things that have been happening with YouTube. And just a high-level recap. YouTube content has certainly had its share of controversies, right? And then YouTube, I think, early on in response to that, came up with YouTube Kids.
Yeah.
I have 3 kids at home, and they're all on YouTube Kids. They all are on YouTube, right? So this is something I follow. I missed some of this news until my wife brought it to my attention and said, you should really pay attention to this. My conspiracy theory is that Google controls search, and are they controlling stuff that you don't want to see about Google? Because this looks bad. I mean, this is a black eye on Google and YouTube, in my opinion. And there's there's 2 different things. There's one where in the middle of a kid-oriented video, there is this clip of this really creepy character encouraging the kids commit suicide. Now, there's also a softcore pedophile ring inside of YouTube where people are finding videos of children and posting inappropriate comments, and YouTube also suggesting other videos with other children in them, which is also bad doesn't even begin to describe it. So personally, this hit me obviously right at home because, my kids are like 11, 5, and 2. They all have iPads. They're all on YouTube. My middle son saw the picture of the creepy character called Momo that's encouraging kids commit suicide, and literally came to me crying in tears and was like, Dad, you need to talk to your hacker friends. You need to find these people and make it go away. So I was like, okay. I mean, that, talk about hitting at home. There's nothing else ever in the show in 14 years that hit home as much as this. So I did some research on it. I know our own YouTube channel has had issues over time, copyright violations. It's been taken down, and I don't know why. Now, I do know that our friends in the community who are completely anonymous in this sense, I don't even know who they are, but working for the larger social media networks, they've actually recognized my complaint as I go through the back channels, and they realize it. They're like, oh, that's Security Weekly's content. We need to adjust our algorithms. I don't know. They're not allowed to talk publicly about that at all, obviously, because if you know how the algorithms work to filter out bad content, you could potentially create methods to bypass that. So I respect the work that they're doing. And this is a hard problem to solve, which is why I'm kind of calling upon the community, putting a spotlight on it as something that we need to pay attention to. Obviously, our peers that are working for YouTube and other larger social networks, I'm sure they're really stressed out and very busy dealing with this problem right now, but it's something that needs to be addressed.
Well, and I think the challenge here is the content starts out looking very normal and then switches.
4 minutes into the video. So I linked to pettymom.com. She was in the doctor's office with her child. They were watching a video together. He had like a bloody nose or something. I mean, kids always have something, something going on as everyone has kids, right? And she was trying to take his mind off it. They're watching YouTube, and about 4 minutes in is when the Momo meme came on and made suggestions about suicide.
Yeah.
And so she took to the internet and wrote a blog post. It's been picked up by many different outlets as well. Not enough, in my opinion. And I think that there is general confusion. Well, my wife tells me on Facebook about people going, what do I do, right? They're turning off YouTube. They're removing the app from people's kids' tablets. But as we know, if our kids especially, they're all hackers. They're going to find a way if they want to, right? So a lot of the responsibility does fall on YouTube to do this, but it's still it's not an easy problem to solve. It's one we tried to solve at university, Dave, to be honest with you.
And we have it's a nightmare for us because we run the filters for all the schools. And so we have different policies in an elementary school in West Warwick than an elementary school in Warwick versus the high school. The YouTube issue has been huge for us over time because they tried to do YouTube for education. Could you pass this through? The second we passed it through, I had a principal call me and say, I just walked into my third grade room and they were watching animated porn on the thing. And then what ends up happening is you lock the whole thing down and somebody comes in and knows how to tether to their phone.
Yep.
And they bypass everything.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, when you've got a video that looks legit, deep in, and then all of a sudden it cuts to these scenes, whether it's the softcore porn aspects, and or this Momo piece, how do you catch it? I mean, it's buried 4 or 5 minutes into the video, and then all this disturbing content comes up. I don't know how you police this well, but
so this website, it was an article written by The Guardian that says pre-moderation, where videos don't make it onto YouTube Kids until they've been watched in full by a human being, is realistically, in their opinion, the only way to keep the platform safe from malicious pranksters. But that doesn't, as we know, that doesn't scale.
Right. It doesn't scale. You've got how many
close.
People sitting at Google in the YouTube division watching a full-length video before they allow it to be turned? It doesn't scale.
My somewhat educated guess, and I don't really have any inside information here, but my guess is that they do watch some. That not everything is automated by an AI engine. As we know, when we do analytics for security, you're not trusting 100% your machine learning and your AI, right? If you're trusting it, it's with periodic human checks to make sure that it's in line. I guarantee that YouTube is.
But here's the yin and the yang for technology, right? Is we're talking about a specific instance inside a video for YouTube, right?
Yeah.
The technology at the filter levels now allow us to look for keyword, right? And so now we can look for keyword patterning. And so we can start to look at bullying, suicide prevention, all of these kinds of things in the technology. The schools now turn around and say, am I now responsible because I have the technology?
That's always
to
been a
do
debate.
that.
Yep.
And should we get into this? And as Ocean, we sit here and say, should I be offering that because I don't know about my own liabilities relative to letting that stuff go through? It's really, really a hard problem.
That's why I think the responsibility does need to fall on YouTube. However, their level of due diligence is not going to meet everyone's requirements, as is your case with K through 12 in the schools, right?
Yeah. I mean, this is an opportunity for somebody to come up with some sort of video.
Great point. Great point. Yeah. So obviously my family was upset. Right now in my home, I do use a technology from a company called Circle. They're partnered with Disney. You can go on Amazon and buy the device. It's fairly easy to set up. And I, a while ago, basically Andrea and Santa Bria had recommended this technology, and I'm like, I need something. And at the time when I first implemented it, I wasn't even filtering on content, right? Because our kids use their iPads. We're watching them in a public place. We do a lot of education. I mean, they grew up with me, right? So they know. And my wife is married to me, so she translates that down to our kids, right? Very security conscious household, and very conscious of the content that the kids consume, but it's more of an education and training. So I got the Circle technology primarily to enforce limits, right? To say at a certain time, your iPad doesn't have internet access anymore, right? Like whatever bedtime is, or whenever you want that half an hour in bed, that's fine. But at 9 o'clock or whatever bedtime is, the iPad internet turns off, right? So that was one thing. Also, there's a length of time that they can accumulate during a 24-hour period. You've got 5 hours of time, and maybe that varies. During school, you've got 3 hours of time. On the weekends, you've got more time. So you can limit time and set bedtime. That's why I adopted the technology initially, because it was way out of control before I had those filters. But then the first YouTube kind of controversy came out with ElsaGate, right? There was Disney's Frozen movie that had inappropriate content, videos associated with it. And then so I started implementing content restrictions. So I can filter adult content, explicit content, safe search on Google, and YouTube restrictions. I don't know what that means. Full disclosure, and I don't mean to knock the company. I use their technology. They are not communicating with me about how that works or doing a briefing with me. So, I mean, that's just fact. That's what it is, what it is. So I'm curious how that worked. I'm like, you know what? I'm just going to enable it anyway, right? If it stops one thing from happening, bad thing from happening, it's worth it to click the little box and say it's working. Now, my kids were kind of shocked by this because they hadn't seen any of that adult content. So maybe it's a testament to the technology that I'm using in my house that we haven't seen any of this content because they are filtering it through this app. So I did implement that, and that's where it stands today. I want to see YouTube do a better job of policing the content. Again, very difficult problem to solve. Opportunity for innovation, I believe, Matt. I agree with you. also an opportunity to educate your kids about, when they do see something on anything they see on the internet, if it doesn't feel right to them, to come get a parent, right? That's why my wife showed the picture to myself. It wasn't to upset them. It was to say, if you see this, come get us, right? Come get one of your parents, mom or dad, whoever's home at the time, so that we can deal with that. So you don't have to, don't continue watching it. Don't listen to what anyone says on the internet. It was a teachable moment as well.
Yeah, I think education's part of this. And I think one of the challenge with Momo specifically is it tells the kids, no, you can't tell your parents. You got to keep this secret.
Right.
And that's hard for a kid to understand that, no, you should tell your parents, right? So there is aspects of education here so that things like Momo, who is trying to deter kids actually talking to other people, adults especially, about this, I think is the big challenge here, because if your kids don't know and they see this, then they're scared that they can't tell, because the threatening aspects of how Momo is trying to convince these kids to do these just horrific acts is just, from a parenting perspective, is just freaking scary.
Well, the other thing is the pedophiles were communicating with the children via YouTube comments. Now, YouTube has since gone disabled comments on a lot of those videos, but that was another scary thing. Basically told my younger kids, there's no reason why you should be communicating with anyone on the internet without mom or dad present, right? So I think it did bring up those valid points of communicating with your kids, which has been part of our strategy with our children using the internet since day one. However, it's not enough, obviously.
Not, because the stuff's still getting through.
And I would posit this, take it one step further. I've got a kid that's autistic, and imagine if you had an autistic child who has very little in the way of judgment filters at all, probably won't come and tell their parents, even if you're the best parent in the world. Then it goes, you throw disabilities on top of the attraction of looking at this stuff. It's crazy.
So, Joff,
it is just crazy.
I have one at home too. My oldest son, my middle child's autistic, and he has a group. This is a true story. I mean, this happened last week. My wife gets a phone call from one of the other kids in his SSN class and said, "Do you know about this group chat with this one girl who's very disturbed?" And maybe it's the Momo thing. I'm not quite sure where it came from. But she would, on the group chat, talk to one of the kids saying, well, if you love me, then you're going to show me your love by doing something harmful to yourself. Like, show me, prove it to me.
It's an extension of Slender Man was another thing that happened on the
internet. I don't know where this came from, but the mom called Lauren and said, are you aware of this girl on this group chat that's talking to the kids like this? And my wife just freaked out, right? Because I have an autistic child that doesn't have that same sense of reasoning. And so they're very susceptible to this kind of activity. And so they kicked her out of the group, so she's not in this group chat anymore. But again, is that enough?
Right.
To really protect these kids.
It's scary for us as security people knowing how this stuff works, to know that it's not enough.
It's not enough, right? And so, she's not in the group anymore. But now we have to go talk to our son to say, look, that's not, these types of activities aren't normal. Don't fall into them. But it's happening, and it's happening near and dear to home with our son in this group of kids that he's in, which is, a very good school district, a great teacher, great program. But again, these kids, some of these autistic kids can't reason to that same level, and
to
it's
that
tough.
end, and Dave, I hate to put you on the spot, right? But we're talking about protecting our children, which are very small in number compared to all the K through 12 students in the schools in Rhode Island. Are there discussions happening, or how are you handling I'm sure it's an ongoing discussion how you handle content filtering, right?
And it's we really do like the iBoss platform, and we've stayed with it. It's grown over time. But like I said, now you're getting into a situation where, from a liability, flat out responsibility, is the school responsible for using their technology, or even buying and implementing technology that can prevent, one suicide? Well, you might say yes to that unless you think about all the other liability aspects that happen.
The ones they don't prevent that
And
they
so
could be
these-
held responsible
These
for.
are these discussions are happening all the time.
Yeah, I mean, we actually, I mean, this is just heartfelt because one of the kids that was in my son's program a year ago transferred schools and ended up committing suicide. That's a difficult thing for these kids to understand. And we don't know the circumstances, but I mean, this is a horrific thing to happen. And I don't know what the influencers were, but stuff like this, it only potentially makes that worse, right? And how do we help police that to the point where we can try to protect our kids and help our kids not fall victim to some of these aspects?
And these get into privacy rights too, and you know, you move around. So, you know, these blended learning classrooms that are now taking out from an application perspective, you know, into the classroom, hundreds of applications, right? That, you know, before you'd lock it down and maybe it was just Google, right? Now it's like all these applications. The teachers individually want to grab a Math Blaster or some application, right? And have you ever read the terms and conditions for some of these? Some of them are literally, you will give away the rights to your firstborn and, you know, pictures and modifications of those pictures. And I mean, I've read terms and conditions for legit K-12 stuff that you would just, you'd freak by reading.
Well, and again, we don't want to be the organization of no as security, right? We don't want to say, and I feel bad for the parents and kids that are like, no, YouTube's out. There's a lot of benefit that also comes from YouTube, right? There's bad stuff as we've identified.
But there's a lot of great, but there's a ton of great stuff. If you want to learn how to do anything,
you go to YouTube.
You go to YouTube.
My
you look
oldest
up a video.
son loves to build stuff. He he could probably like frame an addition onto our house just because he's watched all the YouTube
he's
videos.
watching YouTube.
Sometimes I ask him questions now because I'm like, did you watch a YouTube video on like how to do? He's like, oh yeah, you could do this. I'm like, really? And my youngest son, all of a sudden I'm playing in his room one day. And I'm bringing all the, he's the youngest of 3 boys, right? So I'm bringing all the old toys from the boys, right? And there's all the Marvel and DC comics characters. He's naming every single one of them. That's Iron Man. That's Hulk. That's Thanos. The whole thing. I'm like, Thanos. I'm like, I don't know if I've watched Infinity War yet. Like, can we watch? He's like, Dad, can we watch Hulk? Can we watch Iron Man? Like, yeah, we can watch all those together. Yeah. That's awesome. So, I mean, that's a very positive thing.
Yep.
He's gotten into superheroes. Yeah. Nothing wrong with getting into superheroes, right? That's a positive influence in a kid's life. It's something dad and sons can do together. We can go see the new Marvel movie.
Yeah,
positive things.
Or we can go figure out how to replace a front washer drawer that my son busted out because
dishwasher's broken at home, dude.
How to replace the igniter in your stove. I mean, there's a lot of great educational things out there that are really good to be able to view and go, oh, wait, I can do that myself. I know how to fix that. I don't need to call a repairman and spend $150 trip charge and parts and labor and all this other stuff.
That's one of the greatest things that came from YouTube.
Right.
Home improvement, too. Also, you look at all the security content on YouTube as well.
Yeah.
And, I mean, my son learned how to program in Python by watching YouTube videos and learning how to do that instead of the way I did it, which was stealing other people's scripts. And I'll say this, that we're struggling with this, and we're all very technically savvy. We're fully aware of the problem and the challenges. I know when this story first came out, my phone blew up with texts from my friends who aren't technically savvy going, what can I do? I can't ban YouTube because my kids know how to get around my bans.
Yeah. Right.
So, how do I solve this problem? So I figure if we don't know how to do this, parents that aren't as technically savvy as we are probably really panicking and feel completely helpless and overwhelmed.
Yeah, they're like, what is Circle? They're like, what can you do with Circle? You can put time limits?
Yeah.
And I explain it to them, and they're like, oh, my God, I need one of those.
Well, I was doing that with my firewall.
Yeah, right? I do it on my firewall,
I do it with my firewall, right? So at home, I have everybody has a reserved address, and then based on the MAC address, I limit times. So at 9 o'clock, look, it's time to go to bed. I'm shutting off the internet for you, right? So you can do it that way.
Sure.
But then my daughter figured out how to bust into my freaking firewall and reset this. I'm like, she was like 17. I'm like, what?
That's, you know what? That's just a proud parent moment, dude.
It
when my
is,
sons
but I'm
do
like,
that stuff,
damn
I'm
it.
like, you shouldn't have done it, but I am so proud. I am so proud.
And she's not very technically savvy, but she knew how to pop my
Oh,
my
yeah, she had a
firewall.
goal in mind. When someone
Right.
has a goal in
And
mind, right?
she changed the settings so
I mean,
she
Dave knows. I mean, and Joff, right? We've worked in education.
Yeah.
If your students have a goal in mind,
Yeah.
they don't necessarily need to be computer science students to get around
No.
what they want to
That's
accomplish
right.
their goal, right?
Yeah, she you know, her degree has nothing to do with technical. She wants to do event planning and stuff, but she's popping my firewall
Right.
at 17 to reset the stupid settings, right? So yeah, I mean, our kids are going to find ways around this.
They're going to go to their friend's house where they haven't blocked you. Or, you know, there's a million.
Well,
ways.
it's not that as much as she's talking to her friends and they're like, yeah, run this script. You know, you take down daddy's firewall, you reset some settings, and boom, there you go. And she was doing it at 17. I'm like,
Right.
okay, that's really good, but no, stop that, right?
Right, yeah.
But
Not in my house. No, you can't run that script, and you cannot take down my firewall.
Oh, I'm sure they've
Sorry,
tried, Joff. They've tried.
so I
they've
need you to.
tried.
Not only do you have to come into studio to have a conversation, now I'm flying you to Colorado so you can set up my firewall so she can't pop it anymore.
Anytime, man. Just supply the alcohol. I'm there.
I got cabinets full of it. Choff, don't worry.
That's why I use DNS RPZ lists, because nobody knows how to work DNS, so I don't have to worry about my son figuring that out. He can figure the firewall out, but he's not going to understand the
Yeah, but
intricacies
that'll
of
be
DNS.
next. If you're not blocking DNS out of your, they're like, oh, I can just point to someone else's DNS server and I can resolve anything I want. It's great.
Not on my network.
Yeah, there you go. Unless you're blocking all other DNS.
So Joff, what I think you need to do is provide us with a set
Like
of
a template,
template for configuration for a firewall that now we can share with everybody to figure out how to lock down their house so their kids can't pop their firewalls anymore, and we can enforce our restrictions that we try to put on their
Now,
firewalls.
we're going to run technical segments about some of the firewall work I've done here, but I haven't restricted DNS in the office here just in case we do need to go point out externally and not internally and bypass some of that stuff.
Yeah, because we've got to have internet connectivity for us to do this live stream,
Yes.
folks, and our live webcast. So we're not going to lock things down to the point where we can't, function.
I mean,
as
at
a
first it was
business,
like,
but-
Paul's responsible for running the network. And then we're like, well, now it has to have like high levels of redundancy and stuff like that. And this is all of us know here. That greatly complicates things.
Yeah.
When you have to have the load balancing and or failover.
Which is why you unplugged the network connection.
I did. I
today.
unplugged the switch
Yeah.
this morning and just to see what would happen.
Just to see what happened. You worked, but the rest of us were broken. But we don't have that luxury at home necessarily. And to your point, non-technical folks have no idea how to do some of this stuff.
Right.
There is nothing that's easy for them to put some of these controls in place because they're not tech savvy, which is a lot of our friends. And we're struggling with it as technologists. And these folks are even further behind than us. And that's a vast majority of the people that are out there trying to protect their kids.
You know what? I think, I'm sorry, Al, a great segue is Robert Graham's article, which is one of my favorite Robert Graham articles to come out in maybe of all time. And that's saying something because he writes some of the best articles on networking and security and in the internet of all time. And he came here to Rhode Island actually to speak at B-Sides Rhode Island. Love Robert. And he got this basic question about TCP and wrote this like 3-page like history comparing it to the phone system. So he got this question that said, a very basic question. When sending a TCP packet, is the packet act at every node in the route between the sender and the recipient or just by the final recipient? Now, based on that question, Robert wrote this entire awesome, everyone needs to go read this article. I love it. About how in the phone system, right, the X.25, right, every hop in the route needed to act on those packets and interact in some way above and beyond the way routers as we know and love today operate at layer 3 and just kind of pass it along on its way. And it really, the quote that I think summarized it the best was, the phone system was created in the 1800s, and then 2007's release of the iPhone phone companies wanted to control the applications that users ran on their network. The OSI model that you learn as a basis for networking isn't what you think it was. It was designed with the AT&T phone network and IBM mainframes, which is a similar technology, being in control over your applications, right? Your dumb terminal meant that the main server was in control of your applications. TCP/IP and the internet changed this, putting all the power in the hands and the ends of the network. The OSI model that we all know and love today, and you end up learning it is a RET Connect model with all the original important stuff stripped out. Only the bits that apply to TCP/IP are left. I think it really, even building upon what Robert wrote, speaks to the pushing of security to the endpoint, to the user, and to the application. And everything else in the middle now, I mean, Dave,
it's a transport layer.
Dave lives this every day. Everything that's in the middle is a transport layer, right, today.
Well, and we would hopefully moving more and more and more to, in fact, we're talking with Internet 2 and the regionals about what our next gen looks like, right? And it's the word is hollow core smart edge, right? So it's like, and moving more to waves but that's going to take.
It's going to take time.
We got a lot of infrastructure out there.
Yeah, we do. A lot of legacy architecture.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah, infrastructure out there. Yeah.
But I thought that article was great to talk about the push from and I think we see this today too, right? Network security or security 20 plus years ago was about the network and even to a certain
extent,
the
perimeter,
the operating system, right? And today you deploy an application into serverless and people access it on their phone, and everything else in the middle is just a way from the user to get to the application.
Mm-hmm. And nothing in the way to stop it or inspect it or do anything with it. It is literally a transport layer now.
Harry from Edgewise is doing a panel at RSA. It's about the evolution of the firewall, and it's very much about like the why we needed them in the first place and how. And I think you were talking about this earlier, David. It's interesting. Steve Carmody, do you know Steve? If you've met Steve, the Shibboleth Project, Federated Identity.
Yeah, that's Steve from Brown.
Yes. I worked with Steve at Brown.
God, he's been working on trust and identity for like forever.
Since I started at Brown in 2001, and even before that, right?
So that's a whole division at Internet 2 now.
Yeah,
trust and identity is an entire division.
Steve works very closely with Internet 2 on Federated Identity, and now Steve, being the very smart, way ahead of me in terms of intelligence and forward thinking, was like, Paul, firewalls are a really bad idea. And I'm like, Steve, I didn't say this, but I was hired as a firewall guy at Brown. Like, you realize this, right? But it took me a long time to realize that Steve was absolutely correct in that the things inside the network that get in the way do just that. They get in the way of users interacting with applications.
Well, and I was, and going back to our earlier statement about, the web filtering technologies to protect kids against things, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that requires SSL decryption, right, at the filter, right?
Right.
Which is hugely resource intensive, right, in the network, right? And so we get into a huge situation whether or not, and maybe 10 of the districts in our state actually do break open packets in there to get to that level of granularity, and they pay for it.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, because it's an expensive activity. Yes.
Yeah. Especially if you do it in the firewall. I mean, I bought Fortinet because Fortinet's throughput is like extraordinary, right? And if you do Fortinet or Palo and you then add on SSL decryption on in the web filter technology, the thing goes like
right?
Smaller environments probably can get away with it,
but at 100 gig speeds,
where
at 100 gig speeds, where bandwidth is important. It's so cost prohibitive.
You can't do it on your 100 gig segment.
No.
You can do it on your office segment, but not on the big segment.
Correct.
There's just no way.
Yep.
Well, we don't want to pay for that.
Right. Cost prohibitive.
Yeah, but even Providence, as a district is at 10 gig with us, from a school district. Right, so even at that rate, I mean, it's crazy.
That's a non-trivial cost as well. That's expensive.
Right.
I wanted to talk about Huawei for a moment. A lot of things have happened with Huawei over the past few years.
In the past, 3 to 4 months too.
In 3 to 4 months,
Yeah.
it's really ramped up. I thought this was a good article from CNET. They talked about basically everything you need to know about the Huawei controversy. They don't go into the details as to why, for example, the federal government has said we will not purchase Huawei products.
Yep.
Also, my new Huawei tablet that I have.
Fully embedded with Chinese malware.
Fully embedded with Chinese malware. Now, what's interesting is this one of the better reviewed tablets, Android tablets on the market today. In fact, I like it very much. However, it's from Huawei. Now, my rationale was everyone who's got an iPhone or a computer or Apple or whatever the hardware is, it's a System 76 laptop, guarantee you the hardware is all manufactured in China. Like all the electronics are manufactured in China. Huawei seems to be on that naughty list for a whole host of reasons. The article talks
Legit,
about
by the way.
23 counts. Speaking of legit, Alan, I think you're correct. 23 counts pertaining to the theft of intellectual property, obstruction of justice, and fraud related to alleged evasion of U.S. sanctions against Iran. So clearly they are on the naughty list for good reasons.
They are?
However, I'll still use their tablet because...
And their fire... Well, no.
Well, their firewalls were shipped directly, not Huawei. Our firewalls were shipped directly from China, which means the malware is just embedded
it's right on the firmware.
Right
we're just like
factory.
It's just right there.
It's good, but
Yeah,
I don't know.
It's all good.
When
So
you
they're scraping this video right now, and they're
you're
trying
telling
to...
me that Cisco doesn't manufacture a lot of their stuff in China?
They
all
do.
of their stuff
Yeah,
in
but
China?
Of course.
But the backstory on that, right, is one of the reasons they're doing a lot of that manufacturing was part of a settlement outside of court because they had stolen so much Cisco intellectual property, and Cisco wanted to do business and build in China. So the reason that didn't end up going through from a court perspective was a, call it, agreement, right? That and because there's no doubt. I mean, you could look at the Huawei router series, right? Cisco 1710. It's the same damn thing.
Right.
But they found, signatures in their code and everything else. But so, I mean, there's no question about the theft stuff. Not to people who are been in the industry as long as I am.
Right.
Yeah, we've known that for a while.
Yeah.
What I think other people now are starting to realize that, that stuff's getting not only stolen, but also potentially compromised.
Yeah. Right.
As part of that new manufacturing process to ship that stuff over to the U.S., Apple's got the same thing. It might be designed in California, but it's being built
manufactured in
and
China.
manufactured in China, right? So what changes are happening potentially to those systems as they're being built? So I think there are legitimate concerns around theft and aspects of backdoors and or malware or other things. This is why I always tease you. We bought our firewalls from China. I'm like, we got Chinese malware built in. He's like, good, I can analyze it, right?
Right. Yeah.
But the alternative is, where else are you going to buy firewalls? What firewall manufacturer doesn't have at least some Chinese components in? And I don't think there are any.
I'm not sure that there are.
Well, I think the big threat is the 5G.
Right.
China's so poised to be dominant in 5G technologies.
But you've seen the EU put some limitations on Huawei technologies for 5G, specifically for those concerns, which puts Nokia and some of the other providers in a better position, at least in the EU. I don't know what we're doing in the States, but the EU has actually tried to lock aspects of this down.
My tablet, I was like, well, maybe I want to buy this at Best Buy so that I can get a warranty on it, except in 2012 or something, Best Buy was like, no, we're not carrying any Huawei gear.
Yeah.
That's how bad it's gotten.
Yeah.
Right?
Right. And you've got the entire EU saying, if we evaluate you, we're going to evaluate under different criteria. Then we're going to evaluate all the other 5G providers because we're worried about potential, not only intellectual property theft, but potential malicious activity. And that's pretty substantial because 5G, as we talked about last week with Steve Brown, 5G is one of those next emerging technologies that is another leapfrog game changer from a bandwidth perspective. And if Huawei gets locked out parts of that market, but they're in a better position than everybody else. What does that do?
My test is like when I get the Huawei tablet, I talk to it in Chinese and I see if it responds. So when I say ni hao, if it doesn't say ni hao back, then I know I'm good, right? Is that a legitimate? It's not a legitimate?
No.
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 Great,
but it probably has a secret microphone embedded in it somewhere.
Well, I mean, you can talk to Google about that. Right? They were under fire recently for that as well.
Yep, last couple weeks.
There was a Segway story that I wanted to go into. Nope, not that one, not the Ring doorbell yet. It was the cloud one where, Cloudborne, a persistent backdoor in the cloud. Now, this came from a security vendor that we've talked about, Eclipsium.
Yep.
And basically what they found was, and I don't know, they did some tests in a lab, right? So this isn't like, they didn't observe it in the wild from what I gathered from the article. But basically they said, look, cloud providers like Amazon, for example, are sourcing all of this hardware. As we've established, this hardware is largely manufactured in China, right? And when you go say, I want a private cloud from a public provider like Amazon, they allocate you your private cloud. Now, maybe you don't want that private cloud anymore, or you shift things around. You're like, well, that private cloud server I don't want in this region, I want in a different region, and I shift it around. Amazon doesn't take that hardware and destroy it. Right? They paid money for it, right? They don't take it and wipe it down to the firmware level of every piece of electronics that's on it. They reallocate it and repurpose it. And what Eclipsium is saying is, if I've got a backdoor on the firmware of an Ethernet card or a backplane or whatever, or BIOS or whatever, that's not getting wiped as it moves from customer to customer. So if you were to target an insecure customer that you could maybe get your malware onto the physical hardware layer of firmware on some device, when that gets repurposed to someone else, now you've got a backdoor into someone else's network, potentially.
Yeah.
It's a stretch. It's not targeted. I agree there, but it's an interesting concept. I think it also supports Eclipsium's business, which is why they're producing their research. But I also, on the flip side, they're bringing up a really great point.
Well, this is more your expertise on the firmware side than mine, but a vulnerability in firmware that's not being patched or wiped and changed will travel with the box if you're not wiping those boxes, right? And that's their point here.
And it can be pretty stealthy.
Yeah.
I mean, the firmware interfaces can look the same. They function the same, except underneath, they're doing some nefarious things. This can happen on a home router. It can happen on firmware inside of an ASIC or wherever, right? It doesn't matter.
Yeah, and I mean, firmware is the one thing that I think with IoT, industrial IoT, and these devices where all the functionality of the device is sitting in firmware, right? Well, there is no operating system on these things.
Well, it depends on what type of firmware. In classic firmware sense, there is an operating system. The difference is it's all on one particular chipset and all in one particular file or software set. In other words, your bootloader, your kernel, your operating system, and your file system, that's what makes up firmware. And so everything is all in one, which is why upgrading it sometimes is a bad experience, because you can brick it because all that stuff is in one. Like when you compromise a Windows system, you have access to the operating system. You may not necessarily have access to the bootloader. The file system may have different protections. The kernel may have different protections and all that stuff. In firmware, if I get access to the firmware, I can control all of that, every single piece of it, including the bootloader, which means maybe if I do reflash the firmware, if I've compromised the bootloader, maybe I can still put some malware in there. So it's a different ball game, which I theorized several years ago, possibly when I was working at Ocean, was when I first started developing some of this research. And I was like, someone could be really evil. And a lot of those evil things I theorized about are coming true today, which is kind of frightening for me. What else do we want to talk about? Well, let's stick on the Cisco and firewalls and thing. And this is a classic attack. So now we're moving up into the higher layers when you're attacking devices. Cisco SOHO wireless VPNs and firewalls are all vulnerable to attack. And I'm disheartened that we're still covering stories like this in the industry today. It just so basically, improper validation of user-supplied data allows you to send malicious HTTP requests to a vulnerable device. An attacker can execute arbitrary code. This is like, you can trace vulnerabilities like this in embedded devices or IoT back 20 years, and it's still the same problem. Years ago, Ed Scotus came on the show and said, we'd solve much of the IoT security issues if we just provided a standard way to manage and administer these devices. And there are frameworks to do that. Azure Sphere and others have been created to do that. However, that has to reach a level of adoption. And, to your point before, we've got so much infrastructure deployed. We've got all these devices deployed all over the place. And fixing that problem is really hard.
Yeah. I did
just imagine if you're 15 or 20 years older and you're just as frustrated.
Right?
I did a paper, a presentation at BSides Nova 2 years ago on NTP.
Yeah.
And what I did was I set up a couple of NTP servers and joined pool.ntp.org and just collected stats on who was connecting. And 62 or 63% of all the IoT devices connecting to me were running a vulnerable version of NTP. Mm-hmm. So the numbers were even higher in the EU versus the US. So it's an ongoing problem. It's something most people don't even know, that their home routers are vulnerable or that they can upgrade their home routers. I think a lot of people think, oh, well, Verizon gave this to me or Charter gave this to me, so they must be managing it. And they're completely surprised to find out 5 years later, no, that's not the case.
Alan, there is something in the NTP protocol that allows you to query the NTP server, and the NTP server tells you something about the clients that have connected to it.
Yes.
And there was a Netgear router that distributed. Did you cover this in your talk too?
Yeah.
An NTP server that was at a university that allowed people to query it about what devices were querying that NTP server. And if you could get that list, you knew those devices querying the NTP server were also vulnerable because they had older firmware.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So there's that. And of course, it's trivial to set up an NTP server and have people connect to it. It's obviously not targeted, but if you're just looking to build your botnet out, that's a fairly trivial way to do it. You have an IP address, you have a geographic location, and you know what version of NTP they're running, and then you can launch the attack. And it's even with that, even if you have good hygiene, like, okay, I'm going to upgrade the firmware on my router on a regular basis, they may not get patched for months or ever.
Or ever.
Right. And so
end of life.
Right. That vulnerability could sit there, and how often do people replace their home routers? I mean, you sit there, you put it in a corner until you realize, oh, my internet's dog slow. You call Verizon, they come out and swap it with a new one, and the old one goes probably somewhere else still with the malware on it.
Even in enterprises, swapping out firewalls is not an easy thing. Right. So there may be some time that passes by before you can do that, right?
You'd be amazed at the amount of antiquated equipment that run mission critical networks. I don't know if you saw the Amherst College was down for 5 days.
Is that UMass Amherst?
No, Amherst College.
Amherst College,
right,
okay.
in Massachusetts was down for 5 days, a month or less than a month ago. Everything. Like, you couldn't swipe your laundry card.
Wow.
It was for 5 days. And it was all associated with god old, antiquated gear that they just hadn't kept up with.
Technical debt caught up with them.
Broadcast storm hit the place, and however it proliferated between that old stuff they had, 5 days. Nothing.
Wow.
I miss broadcast storms. I haven't had a good broadcast storm in a while.
Spanning tree port fast on all your ports, Alan, and you'll experience a good old-fashioned broadcast storm, right? It's true, though. We hope we upgrade and get rid of older gear before things like that happen. But it just haven't done network upgrades here. We experienced, some downtime, here and there, I still feel it's better than if we had waited until it died completely and we're down for 5 days straight.
But
right?
let's go back to our previous conversation. We as technical folks know to check for firmware upgrades. Yeah. They don't come out very often. They're not easy to implement. We're technical.
Well, hold on, Matt. Well, I'll stop you there. In what we used to say at Brown, which is where I think I first heard this term, is that we knew we needed to do upgrades and move forward. And sometimes those would lead to downtime for short periods of time, not 5 days in Dave's example, right? Typically it was less than that. And we'd, get in the meetings and I hear the senior network engineers and they'd be like, you're going to scramble a few eggs to make an omelet. I'm like, yeah, but that makes sense, right? It makes sense.
but think about the home user who has this device in their network, who's not technical and knows that they need to check for firmware upgrades and apply them.
Yeah.
We're technical, and it's hard enough for us to keep up with these upgrades on those devices, let alone somebody who is not technical, who has no idea that they should be updating these devices at home because they buy them from Best Buy, they buy them from whoever, they plug them into their network, they use default settings, they get Wi-Fi connectivity, they get to the internet, they're good.
And it runs for a year.
And
firewall at home.
They run it for years.
My firewall at home is over 430 days of uptime. And, okay, so now it needs a firmware upgrade. And now I remember the scramble the eggs thing, and I'm like, I want to build a new firewall first, and then I want to try and update it so that I say when it fails because I've been in this field too long. When it fails, I want to have a backup to go to.
But how many people are going to go buy another device?
Yeah, they're not network or security engineers.
No,
right?
of course not.
Exactly.
And then they're going to swap it out, make sure everything works okay.
But it's not just the home user; it's the liaison between. We talked about this, but earlier between the IT department and the CFO or the C-suite of the organization, right? So, this is a pretty rich college. Actually, they have a huge endowment, right? And you got to know that the CIO went back and forth asking for money every year to upgrade his network. That's what you do when you're technical, right? But that side of the house said no because networks are invisible when they work.
You're a cost center, right? You're not protecting my environment until you're down for 5 days.
Yeah,
now
you can't
everybody's
do your laundry.
Right now everybody's scrambling, going, "What the hell?" But you go back and you're like, "Yeah, but I've been asking you to upgrade this stuff for 5 years," and they're like, "You need to give me the money." Right?
Yeah,
that's the conversation. That's the risk discussion.
Yeah.
That should be happening to say, look, we can continue to run on this gear, but at some point something's going to fail. So do you want a downtime of 5 days? What's that impact versus giving me some budget so I can slowly replace this stuff over a period of time?
And those are huge projects, though. I mean,
in a university, they're huge.
You probably remember when I was at Brown in 2004, 5-ish time was the time we did the entire huge network upgrade, right? I mean, it was probably one of the of all the Ocean members, probably one of the most massive at the time network upgrades we did. But it was to not incur all that technical debt. Dorms had a lot of the dorms, 144-acre campus. I mean, tens of thousands of network ports. A lot of them were still hubs from back in the day, right? And so it reached a time where we were like, we need to do a network upgrade. Now, when I was working as a security engineer in the network team at the time, looking at all the logistics behind that project. I go to my boss at the time, and he would talk about the numbers and the number of switches and the cost and the number of contractors and the cost for the however many thousands of feet of Ethernet cable you have to run. Having personally experienced that and been part of that team that did that, that was a huge project, huge, massive undertaking.
If you look at
I remember doing it.
You remember, right, Joff? I mean, you had hubs in your dorms, right?
Well, we switched all the way out to the dorms. I remember we had 22,000 deployed access ports.
Yep.
And that was just on a wired network. And then we had, I think, on our campus, roughly 1,700 access points on the wireless.
Yeah.
But that was a shit project.
It goes to the point, earlier when we were talking about the financial aspect of what the markets look like, is I read an analyst report recently that showed that we were spending 1/7 on prevention versus mitigation.
Right.
worldwide, right? So it's costing us 7 times more than we're spending.
Right.
Right. So who do you know? But right, the guy at Target doesn't know that until it happens, right?
I think though you just hit on a great idea for a business model. So like we do a lot of things by subscription now. So we get like our filters by subscription, and we get our coffee by subscription. I think the business model is a home router by subscription. So every year you for $70
Get a new router.
you get a new router pre-configured with all your settings and
I
everything.
think Cisco tried that. When Linksys was part of Cisco, Cisco tried that in the cloud.
Okay.
Like your firmware and all your features like lived in the cloud, and and it failed miserably for I don't know what reason.
Wasn't that Meraki or something?
Well, Cisco.
No, it was linked. It was linked to the Linksys.
It was Linksys.
The Linksys
It was
acquisition.
Was it on the LinkedIn product side?
Yeah,
Linksys,
I think so. Yeah. Because I used to have Linksys, now I have the D-Links, but they're still a pain in the ass. I'm telling you, they're a pain in the ass to upgrade.
Oh, and now you have a new firewall, which I haven't.
Yeah, which you haven't configured yet. But they're a little they're not easy, and sometimes the firmware upgrades aren't even available.
No,
I had one device that I would check periodically. There's no upgrades for some of those devices, even still today, and so those things are still sitting out there in the wild.
Right.
Yeah.
So your business model's beautiful, right? It's like as part of my ISP. My ISP should be I'm paying them monthly for service. Give me a new. Yeah, I have 1 gig fiber now at home. Can I upgrade that device, or you just swap that thing out every so often so that I know I'm running the latest and greatest?
Yeah, better yet, you send an engineer out to go swap that router out for new hardware.
You pay $99 to have the thing installed.
Yeah.
Initially, but it's part of my fee. If somebody came out annually and made sure it was in good shape,
Sure.
that would be great for a lot of people that aren't technical that can't do this.
I think a lot of ISPs are going to. I mean, Dave, I don't know if you've seen this, but Cox, especially in the Rhode Island area, is offering services way above and beyond internet and phone.
Oh, sure.
Right? Like you can have a home security system. You can have them run their Wi-Fi and cameras and all this other stuff. Right? I think that's the next evolution of ISPs is, and maybe as time goes on, they're going to manage all that stuff for the users, which is a great business model for the ISPs, but helps out all these homes and small businesses that's not what they do, right? I mean, the reason why I found Security Weekly, I'm the CTO, and I'm doing all our internal network stuff. Yeah, that's great, but the benefit to us is I talk about it on the show and I help other people by talking about what I learned. Very few people are in that same situation,
if
right?
You're
they need the Cox and Verizons of the world to come out and help them.
If you're a
with
restaurant
that.
and your business is producing great quality food,
you should
getting
be
it on
coming
the
up
table
with a
fast,
great
with great
cocktail
service
menu and a great food and right? That's your job.
That's
right?
your job.
To
Your
upgrade
job's
router.
not to manage your routers and your point of sale systems and all the other stuff. Somebody do that for me and just make sure it's
you have to
secure.
segment your markets. So I think that's a good one for from a home perspective. But the larger when you get into enterprises and things like that, this delta between operating income or operating cost and capital costs is a real thing. I have lots of my members, the larger ones especially, who say they can get capital better than they can get an increase in their operating expense, which hurts them when they want to move to the cloud, right? As an example.
It's a great point.
It's
Dave.
a real challenge.
It is a challenge.
We balance that at Security Weekly all the time.
Well, not only Security Weekly, but I balance this at other companies I work for, Tenable and Qualys and others. Right? It was easy to get CapEx. Give me a perpetual license with annual maintenance because I could go get the CapEx budget. Yep. But as a public company, you don't want CapEx necessarily. Exactly. You don't want the 80% and then the 20. You want the third, and predictability of revenue. So we've seen this transition away from CapEx more to a subscription OpEx model. But it's easier for some organizations to get that CapEx, to your point. And so it's hard. It's a hard model for some of them.
And the CapEx is hard because the costs are hidden over time. Like, how long is your gear going to last? Yep. I mean, Dave can attest. How do you know when you need to go from 10 gig to 100 gig, right?
Right.
In that time span when you've bought that 10 gig equipment, your university likely could have upgraded, gotten a grant for that research that now needs 100 gig. That could happen in a short time span.
Yeah, very short. We skipped 40.
Right? We
Wait,
went
wait,
right from
we
10 to
skipped-
100, right?
Yeah.
We skipped it.
It was 1040.
It was 1040, 100, right? And it used to be the 100 was like crazy, like it was costing $300,000 a card, per end, right? So
Right.
now we just skipped 40. I mean,
So are we going to skip 400 and just go to terabytes?
Who knows?
Right?
Right.
That's the cool part about your job, Dave, is you'll see that before any of us.
Way before any
way
of
before
us.
any of us will.
Not in the
Dave's
enterprise.
like, oh, man.
No, actually, it is the cool part of our job because I actually get to see the science that's driving
Yeah.
this stuff. Like I get to meet the scientists that are doing things like, data visualization models of like reefs in the Indian Ocean and, and things like that, or doing cyber archaeology with like drones and ground penetrating radar
Or,
and
like, even-
rendering this stuff in caves, virtual reality
Well,
caves.
the virtual reality cave at Brown,
the
right?
one at Brown is cool. It's called
was
the Yurt.
way ahead of its time.
Well,
I mean,
it
there was
is.
when I started at Brown in 2001, and everyone was like, "There's a virtual reality cave." In 2001,
Yeah.
that was
And now it has 760 cores, 67 cameras, and you go in there and you could do virtual painting. Like I went in there, it's awesome. And you're just wearing like a pair of Polaroid glasses. It's not an immersive thing. You go in there and you can paint in the air, and they got RISD artists to come in, so you can go in and you can like click on their folders, and all of a sudden the room explodes in a jungle, and it's all up. It's fabulous stuff.
We need to do a Security Weekly tour, and we need to take a field trip to the cave at
We
Brown
should
University.
record in the cave.
Yeah,
That would
yeah.
be pretty cool.
It's a cool place.
Does Sam still run? Is he still there?
Sam Fulkerson.
Yeah.
He's on the research side. He's not in the cave. But
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. I have connections.
Yeah.
Dave, and if
Yeah,
worst
it's good
case, we
for-
can call Dave, right? if my
can we-
connections have
can-
moved
can we
on,
do
which
it?
is sounds like, we need a tour.
Think
of the
about our
cave.
background just shifting behind us, right?
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's a very cool
Hey,
place.
Paul, maybe we should put together an entire academic research series.
Absolutely, man. Given our background, especially Joff, I mean, it's just it's really cool stuff.
Well,
Yeah,
there's-
I've got connections too. I mean, I can lean on like many faculty that I used to work with.
Yeah, I mean, to Dave's point too, like, yeah, security and networking is cool too, but the research that's benefiting from our network architecture and security architecture is just really cool, and stuff that like we're not, every day we're looking at all the security stuff and vendors and packets and all that stuff, but their worlds are arguably more interesting in a lot of cases than what we're trying to do. So yeah.
Yeah, and they're pushing it. You should look up the the stuff that's going on at I2 on the trust and identity stuff. That that
We need to have Steve Carmody back on the show. We had him on years ago.
Yeah, that stuff is. In fact, I'm going. That's where I'm going next week. Is the I2 conference? Got Global Summits in DC next week. So
Yeah. Okay, I remember
So
that
down
conference.
there.
Yeah,
it's great. So.
Let's see. So this one is a little concerning in that, we've talked about Adobe vulnerabilities since the beginning of time, essentially, right? Like, everyone's laughing, right? I mean, it seems like all of their products are just like really prone to vulnerabilities. And today, when you load a PDF, a lot of times it just loads in your browser.
Right.
And I don't know about everyone else, but do you feel safe about that? You're like, well, it's not an Adobe product. It's still a PDF. And, our shit detectors go off anytime we load a PDF in anything. But there was a company that did some research. I forget the company that did it. Using their detection technologies, they basically found that when you load a PDF in your browser, there's some zero-day vulnerabilities, and they developed an exploit accordingly.
Still.
Now, EdgeSpot was the vendor. They found this in December of 2018. It looks like Google has not patched the vulnerability. Primarily, it leaks data from your computer to an external site. I didn't see anything more kind of scary than that, although you could probably build on that. Alan, you've seen this,
Yeah,
right?
so-
I mean,
so I saw
you work
it.
for Recorded Future, so
Yeah. So I mean, right now what they've said is that they can get it to load a URL.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, URL can include JavaScript, and we've seen plenty of fileless malware. It doesn't
Right.
appear that works here, but at the very least, they can do a pretty heavy profile of what your browser capabilities are because that's how, if I'm running malware, that's how exploit kits probe the systems, is to send a JavaScript down and get all the information about the affected system back. So especially in a target attack, that could be very useful just for gathering information. But if you can then weaponize that with the fileless, using a JavaScript malware or a JavaScript loader, then you can go even further with that.
Right. Because that just happens by default. I mean, I think most users don't even realize it's happening or configure it to the contrary. The PDF just loads right in your browser, and you're like, oh, that's convenient. I'll just use it.
Right. And you're thinking, well, I'm not using Adobe.
So I'm safe because I'm not using an Adobe product.
Right. I'm using
Yeah.
I'm using the Google Chrome loader, or Safari loader, or Firefox loader. I'm using that PDF reader, not Adobe. So I don't have those same vulnerabilities.
Now, does this cross browsers, or is this one's just Chrome?
It's just Chrome.
Okay.
But
you
each
do
of the
in other
browsers-
browsers. This feature does exist. Yeah.
Right. Well, we don't know if the vulnerability exists,
But
but
the feature does. Yeah.
exactly. So I don't think they've tested it beyond there. So it's really interesting.
I tell you what, I'm not feeling Chrome lately. Given the add-ons that have had their security vulnerabilities, the fact that yesterday, for the first time in a long time, Chrome actually crashed on me, which that was just like I feel like when I first started this podcast and I was using the browser to read a lot of stories and a lot of tabs open, like crashing was just a part of what you dealt with a browser. Largely, they're more reliable today. And then given this vulnerability, I'm a little nervous about Chrome.
I've been using Firefox more and more often.
Yeah.
Firefox has made some serious inroads
On
in
my
security.
phone, I use the Firefox Focus, which is doesn't save any history, or it's supposed to be more big on privacy and hopefully security too. I've been largely setting that as my default browser on mobile devices.
Mozilla started it all. Why have you ever gone off Mozilla?
Good question, Jeff. I got off Mozilla, believe it or not, for performance and reliability issues. I felt that Firefox at the time, 10 years ago or whatever, was very bloated, and Chrome was the leaner, faster browser.
Right.
And I think over time, the tides shift.
Well, with all the Google extensions and everything else,
Yeah.
it's gotten a lot more heavy over the years.
Right.
But yeah, Firefox was the browser, and then we all kind of shifted to Chrome because it was lighter weight.
And your Google account follows you in Chrome.
Some of us have never left Mozilla. Just saying,
That's because of PCI.
for better or for worse.
But I think your point is right. I mean, how many organizations have gone to Gmail and Google Docs?
Yeah.
Yeah.
As their
And so
primary
now you have
platform?
everything connected in Google
Into your browser,
with your
yeah.
Google Drive and everything else. It's
You've been
it's convenience.
You've been assimilated.
Yes,
We have
exactly.
to the Borg.
Really.
Been assimilated to the Borg.
convenient.
That whole balance of security and convenience.
Jeff, we are lazy humans. Convenience is a factor we consider in our usage.
Well, and to Alan's point earlier, right? Fortunately, I think for us, attackers are also lazy.
Right.
If they got more motivated and not so lazy, we'd be in more trouble than we are now, I think, right?
And that is the penultimate risk assessment. How's that for
Ultimate.
dropping Mike's statements?
We talked about IoT a little bit, and there was an article that say researchers and businesses need to work together to expose IoT vulnerabilities. Just based on the title, I disagree with that. I think IoT manufacturers need to build a secure process and secure software coupled with hardware security features, and that's what's really, in my opinion, going to fix the IoT security problem, one that I've been tracking for a long time.
I disagree only in as much as it's late in the evening and I've drunk half a bottle of bourbon, and but until IoT vendors have some sort of motivation or requirement to do something different, why should they bother? Because
speed
and convenience trumps
your
security
favorite
every
person,
time.
Bruce Schneier, is a huge fan of regulation in this realm, Jeff.
Well, that's because he and I think a lot alike.
Maybe on regulation, maybe not so much on encryption.
Well, I mean, no, but I mean, there is no other motivation that's going to make any type of vendor, let's say IoT specifically, that are in the business of producing something that sells, that's easy to use, that's quick, that's seamless, transparent. Who cares about security until somebody makes them do security? The only alternative is regulation.
In this particular case, I think he's actually right, because I think the challenge with IoT devices in general.
I'm right most of the time, Matt.
Oh, okay.
You did imply that Jeff was not right most of the time.
In this particular case, okay.
I picked up on that too.
Well, that's been
we do occasionally agree. We don't always agree, but
that's part of the fun of the
it's
show.
part of the fun of the show.
And the back and forth. Yeah.
But
if we always
I may not
agreed, it'd
be
be
right.
boring.
I know it would.
I
be
may
boring.
not be right, but I'm not wrong.
But I think the challenge in IoT specifically is, if you think about the design criteria for IoT devices, low power consumption and some of the other things, costs, and et cetera, adding security potentially impacts all of those economic components for them. And so unless you regulate it, there isn't an economic incentive for them to do it potentially natively, just because it would impact aspects of how they're producing those devices, how they're producing performance, et cetera. And so in this particular world, I think standardization and some regulation around this is actually important, because then that creates a different economic incentive from the regulatory side than what currently exists in IoT.
But you have to be careful with regulation that it doesn't stem innovation and suffocate innovation.
True.
And that's the balance.
And we'll see this. We'll see this.
Why? Why does that matter?
Because if you don't allow enough competition in the market and you put too many barriers to entry, only the larger companies.
You said innovation, not competition. So distinguish the two.
Yeah, but if regulation impedes my ability to innovate, right? It's a barrier to entry to the market, which limits the number of choices that the consumer has,
right,
and leaves it to basically those that have enough money to create products that meet regulations, and those that may have the next generation innovative product that does solve the problem don't have enough money to play in the market.
I would love to see innovation with security built in, because that would be super disruptive to the industry.
Oh, I agree.
Is it fair to say what you're saying, Paul, is there's not enough economic financial incentive to invest in the research, call it innovation, to make it worthwhile, because there's a perceived or actual cost that makes it more expensive?
That's correct, Jeff.
Yeah.
And I'll take this to cigars, right, where I draw a lot of my experience and knowledge from regulation as an example, is that if I'm a new cigar blender and I go and I get tobacco from all these different places, I put a cigar together, if I've got to go get approval from the FDA and that barrier is so high and I need way more capital than I anticipated, I need a lot of capital to cross that barrier, my cigar's never going to come to market. I think the same thing could happen with technology. If we put regulation at such a high bar that a small startup that we cover all the time in security can't get enough funding to bring their product to market, we as a society and consumers lose out because we're not seeing that new innovation. That means that the players that are already established and have the capital to fund that, they're the only choices.
Yeah. Well, the other problem is that regulation begs and demands definition.
Yes.
And we could sit here and probably have the rest of the night and try to define what IoT actually means in terms of their all individual categories and all the nuances of each category and everything else that goes along with it. And I can tell you that in my limited interface with even our state government here in lovely Rhode Island, to try to teach them what net neutrality meant, it's frightening. So, I do worry about them ever being able to define something.
In your case, Dave, regulation has led to the infrastructure that we have today, right? There was regulation that allowed telcos and other organizations to build the infrastructure.
Well, it was the dismantling of regulation that actually meant 1983, the year I started in this business, was the breakup of AT&T, right?
Sure.
And it was the deregulation that actually created the explosion that we saw since then.
Correct.
Right? So
I don't believe in heavy-handed regulation, because I think if you
smart regulation,
if you go
that
over
enables
the top,
innovation in business to
right,
succeed.
if you go over the top, then to Paul's point, you create a barrier of entry.
Yeah.
You don't get innovation. What I think is there are smart ways to do regulations and some basic capabilities that if we embedded into IoT, we would have a baseline set of security capabilities,
right? But to Dave's point,
still allow
you have to
some level of innovation.
People have to understand.
The key word was smart.
It has to be clear. It has to be clear. Like, what guidelines do I have to meet to bring my product to market? To Dave's point, if those guidelines are kind of fuzzy, it complicates that bringing my product to market. Right.
Which we've seen.
Yeah.
And the problem is the legislators don't understand the technology to understand what is smart and what is not smart regulation.
Nope, not even close.
Which is
Same
why
thing happened in tobacco. There were people who, generations of tobacconists that were going to Congress and educating them about, look, this isn't targeted towards children. If you pick up a copy of Cigar Aficionado, and it's a $300 bottle of scotch coupled by a $200 bottle of wine, a $600 lighter. This is not something that we're targeting towards children. This is a luxury item, but they wanted to classify it in the same way that you do kind of flavored cigars you pay $1 for at the convenience store.
Yeah.
I think in security we have the same things.
We do.
Legislator doesn't understand.
They don't understand.
To Dave's point, right, the nuances.
And the legislators
Don't be dissing Swisher Sweets. Come on now.
Yeah. Well,
I'll just switch your sweets.
we were
all
used to
all
smoke
in
those
day
back
long.
in high
We
school
were
all
all
the
in
time.
high school once. We all was in high school.
I
We
mean, Matt's from
all was in high
Colorado. That may be one of the states that take advantage of Swisher Sweets. That's what I'm saying.
But what I'm saying is legislators should really learn from us as a community to say what is reasonable legislation and requirements around some of this stuff so that we can put some standards in place and some regulation in place potentially. But I don't think legislators really understand it, and they don't really take our input, and they think about this broader, government knows better, we'll do it that way. If you're, to your point, if it's too heavy-handed, it creates a barrier to entry. But if we do it in a very smart way of saying, look, IoT devices should have some level of minimum requirements before we allow them to come onto the market, and creates a level of baseline security, then we can get some. I think we could get some level of standardization that we could leverage, and some people will go above and beyond, but it's leaving it as a Wild West. I don't think it's going to work.
Going back to our
long-term.
conversation on Monday at Business Security Weekly, it's a conversation we need to have. Bruce Schneier and I agree with Bruce in this case. Legislation is going to happen, and it's going to happen either with or without our input.
Yes.
Right? If it happens without our input, it may not be as smart or intelligent as we would have liked it to be.
But I think you hold legislators in too high of a regard, because I don't think they're going to put together legislation based on what they think. I think what's going to happen is the Ciscos of the world are going to write the legislation for them, give them a big check, and that legislation is going to purposely disadvantage
I love your
innovation and so on.
conspiracy theories, right?
So, I mean, but that's
the
just
people
he's
that
right.
control the
That's
money in the
not a
large
conspiracy
corporations will have the
theory.
most influence.
But
That's not a conspiracy theory. That's how politics works.
No,
That's
it's a good
but
point,
it
Jeff.
works two ways, right? It's the Ciscos or the big guys who can influence the politicians, and it's the ACLUs of the world who can also influence, because it's really the people who can afford to have lobbyists at the State House or at the federal government, which is pretty much none of us, right? We run the state network. We run all the agencies. We run all the schools. They passed or tried to pass a bill at the State House on web filtering technology for take-home student technology, and they never asked us. Never. I found out at the last minute, ran to the meeting, sat in front of the legislators and said, I agree with the title of the bill and nothing in the body of it.
Yep.
Right? Because
that's a great way to break it down for that audience.
Completely wrong.
Yeah.
Like technically wrong, the wrong, because they never asked.
Right.
The ACLU wrote it.
Yeah, so I think the problem is that Paul needs to hire a lobbyist to work for Security Weekly and then,
to address these issues with our legislative
in a
bodies.
reasonable way.
Yeah.
But
there are reasonable ways to do this.
The other take, and back to our friend Mark Johnson that we mentioned earlier, the reason I was talking about that Energy Star thing was more of a collaborative effort to create minimum standards for technologies and security, that you could have that stamp that became a collective we rather than have policy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I mean, so in Jeff will like this comment. This is what happened in the credit card industry. They self-regulated. PCI was a self-industry-based regulation to protect the cards, the banks, the providers, without the government stepping in to do it. If we could get all the IoT folks to come together and come up with a standard seal of approval for a set, then we wouldn't need government regulation, industrial at the industry level regulation, or some standards would actually help us here, because PCI has been one of those very successful regulations that came out of the industry, not out of the federal government, compared to others like HIPAA and Gramm-Leach-Bliley and Sarbanes-Oxley, et cetera. There's plenty of examples out there.
All right, so I didn't bring up PCI. Matt did. But I will remind you, Paul, that sometime we need to do a segment that's just focused on PCI.
Sure.
We need to figure that out at some point. But I agree with what Matt's saying in that PCI came about primarily because the card brands, who at the time, 15, 16 years ago, Visa is the major player. They were a privately held company back in 2004, I think it was. They didn't want the regulation because A, they thought it was a pain. B, they thought it would cost, probably A, they thought it would cost them money. B, they thought it would be a pain. C, they thought it wouldn't be effective, let's say. So they started out with this whole PCI program. Absolutely, it was done to try to prevent government regulation because it was believed, and I think we still would mostly agree, that government regulation, most people are like, oh, that's not going to work. Oh, that's a pain in the ass. It's not real, which is ironic because when we're talking about IoT, we're saying the only thing that could possibly make a difference is regulation, government regulation, because there is nothing else. I find it interesting, but I think that there are lessons to be learned from PCI, and I don't completely disagree with how PCI as a program, as a compliance standard has been implemented. I believe firmly in the standards as a baseline or as a framework for how to do Security 101, and I'll argue that with anybody until the cows come home. But the way it's been implemented, there's been so much influence, money plays into it, people with organizations with large pocketbooks that have large influence on the agencies get to steer the way things are done. But again, that's sort of the reality of politics. That's how the world works, whether we like it or not. So doing it effectively means learning how to kind of work within the system to get what you want without either pissing people off, the powerful people with money, or make it in a way that, okay, yeah, that won't cost us much, or maybe there's something in it for us. Maybe there's a benefit, whether it's just goodwill or whether it's branding and marketing. I don't know if any of us can argue that security is ever something that makes things more valuable or is from an economic perspective enhances, what's the term, ROI? What's the ROI on security? There is no ROI on security.
Well, yeah, I think with any
We're honest.
standards, regulations, in any such things, that the goal of people like us are like, it should benefit the public health, the greater good, goodwill, right? To your point, Jeff. But as Jeff also said, anytime you put in any kind of standards or regulations, there's an opportunity for organizations and people to make money. And I think there's always been a balance between those two. I mean, we've seen it with PCI. Sure, PCI helped protect cardholder data, but it also created an entire industry that makes a lot of money.
It does.
Right?
And I think the advantage that the card holders had is you had MasterCard had SDP, you had Visa, Amex, Discover. It was a pretty small group, and they all said, MasterCard had its program, Visa had its program. They brought it all together and said, look, this is a great thing from an industry perspective. But they only had to convince like a couple
Big
other
companies,
groups to do it because there was such a smaller. In IoT, I think the challenge it's so broad. Can you get all of them to agree to a commonality where for the payment card companies, that's pretty straightforward. They were both doing aspects of
I can throw up a Kickstarter tomorrow for a really cool idea of IoT. I can source that hardware from China.
Yep.
A certain percentage, aren't able to source it and others are, and I can bring my new IoT device to market. Anyone can do that today.
Yeah, and you're going to see
I mean, let's cut to the chase, and I want to try to be fair. Most organizations, and you can look at it from an economic perspective, they have a fiduciary responsibility to make money. So they want to do the things that are going to make money or have the highest potential of making money. If there's a way to weave security into that, they will do it. If there's a likelihood, a reasonable expectation that that's going to help them on their bottom line. To cut to the chase, there is no financial incentive to do security for most organizations. No organization is going to do security just because it's the right thing to do.
I think that's changing, though. What
But
did it
why?
cost? What did it cost because of things like Target that cost them $200 million and a massive damage to their brand. And honestly, PCI, started out as the credit card companies, but you could make the comment that once they got that right, the PCI gateways were the things that started the e-commerce markets, right? Mm-hmm. And having trust in PCI gateways was the way you could actually assure people that your e-commerce was going to work, right? And so if you bring that to the IoT markets, there's a lot more recognition now in terms of ROI of what it costs to not be secure, right? And there is now a lot of metrics that you can actually throw out there. That I can now go out. We fought off 320 volumetric DDoS attacks last year against our members, right? Last Monday's was 17 gig, right, against that would have taken them down, right? There are now metrics out there today that I can tell you how much it would have cost those institutions to be down.
Right.
And so those kinds of metrics are starting to become the ROI model that might enhance or help the IoT market, begrudgingly go to.
And the FTC has filed suits against IoT manufacturers.
Some manufacturers,
in the past. I don't think enough to make a difference, but I could certainly see those tides shifting.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to have gradual, and gradations in that, right? So the ones that are doing the self-driving cars that can, crash and kill people and that kind of thing are going to have a different view of what an IoT.
Yeah, and I really think it's all going towards public health and public safety.
Well, so there was an article I didn't throw in here, but Apple just laid off like 200 people out of their autonomous car division this week,
I saw that.
like yesterday or the day before. I don't think they're willing to take on the risk. And so they're downstreaming, right? It's back to this risk conversation a little bit. Autonomous vehicles like everybody's, this is where we're going. And then Apple got into the game and they're like, no, we don't think we're going to go here now. That's interesting, right? Because that's Apple saying, look, I'm not sure it's worth the risk for the potential reward on the other side, maybe based on where some of these autonomous incidents have already happened,
Right.
but they just laid off like 200 people out of that group. That was interesting news to me.
Was that like an executive that watched Silicon Valley and watched the guy that got in the autonomous car that got into the container that got shipped across the
Sent over to China.
China, right?
Yeah, the Hyperloop thing.
Oh, boy. Lots more stories in the show notes, wiki.securityweekly.com. I want to thank everyone for participating in the show. Thank everyone for listening and watching. I guess I'll take us out. Thank you again, everyone. And that will conclude this episode of Ball Security Weekly. Over and out.